Death in the underworld rarely comes with a warning. Usually it arrives dressed in bespoke Armani, poured smoothly into a crystal goblet of scotch. When the most feared man in Chicago raised a poisoned glass to his lips, it wasn't a highly trained assassin who saved him, but a terrified, invisible waitress. To survive in Chicago's unforgiving underworld, one must learn the art of being unnoticeable. For Hazel Jenkins, invisibility wasn't just a survival tactic. It was a physical reality forced upon her by a society that only valued a certain type of woman. At 28, Hazel was undeniably plump, carrying a softness that stood in stark contrast to the sharp, silicon-enhanced hostesses who usually graced the floors of Il Crepuscolo. Il Crepuscolo, the Twilight, was a private subterranean dining club hidden beneath the bustling streets of the Gold Coast. It was neutral ground for the city's most dangerous predators. Made men corrupt politicians, and cartel liaisons broke bread here under the strict, unspoken rule of peace. Hazel had worked as a server in the VIP lounge for 4 years. The men who frequented the club never looked at her twice. To them, she was a piece of the mahogany furniture, a necessary mechanism to deliver their steaks and scotch, devoid of identity. But Hazel's invisibility was her greatest asset. Because no one paid attention to the fat waitress, no one guarded their tongues or hid their sleight of hand when she was pouring the water. Over the years, Hazel had seen payoffs exchanged beneath linen tablecloths. She had heard whispers of hits ordered over plates of veal scallopini. She knew which capos were sleeping with whose wives and which politicians were desperate for a bailout. She catalogued it all behind a blank, pleasant smile, paying off the remnants of her late father's crippling gambling debts with her exorbitant tips. Tonight, the air in Il Crepuscolo was thick enough to choke on. The ambient jazz music playing from the corner seemed muted, suppressed by the heavy, suffocating tension radiating from table 4. At the head of the table sat Alessandro Vitiello. Alessandro was 34, newly crowned as the head of the Vitiello syndicate after a bloody, ruthless purge that had left the streets of Chicago whispering his name in hushed, terrified tones. He was known as the Architect for his cold, calculating mind and his complete lack of mercy. Unlike the aging, boisterous mobsters of the past, Alessandro was sharp, athletic, and possessed a chillingly calm demeanor. His dark eyes missed absolutely nothing. Seated opposite him was Dominic Russo, an older veteran capo who controlled the lucrative shipping ports on Lake Michigan. Russo was a man who belonged to the old guard, flashy loud and deeply resentful of taking orders from a man a decade his junior. Flanking them were their respective bodyguards, Alessandro's right-hand man, a towering stoic named Matteo, and Russo's enforcer, a twitchy, broad-shouldered thug known as Frankie. Hazel stood quietly by the service station, perfectly still, a crisp white towel draped over her forearm. She watched the table with the trained eye of a gazelle, monitoring a watering hole shared with lions. "You're asking for too much, Alessandro," Russo rumbled, leaning back in his velvet chair. He chewed on the end of an unlit Cuban cigar, his heavily ringed fingers drumming against the table. "The ports belong to my crew. My father bled for those docks. You want a 20% tax. That's extortion even by our standards." Alessandro didn't raise his voice. He didn't even shift in his seat. He merely steepled his fingers, staring at Russo with a gaze that could freeze boiling water. "It is not a request, Dominic. It is the new structure. The Colombians are bringing their freight through our routes, and I am guaranteeing their safety. Security requires capital. You will pay the 20%, or you will find yourself relieved of the burden of managing the ports entirely." Russo's jaw tightened. A flash of pure, unadulterated hatred crossed his weathered face, quickly masked by a forced, booming laugh. All right. You're the boss, Vitiello. I may not like it, but I respect the chair. We'll do it your way. Hazel narrowed her eyes. She had grown up around degenerate gamblers and seasoned liars. Russo's laugh was hollow. The capitulation was too fast, too easy. A man like Russo didn't surrender his father's legacy without a fight, unless he knew the fight was already over. To the new structure, then, Russo declared, raising a hand to signal the bar. Let's drink to it. A bottle of the Macallan 25, and make sure it's the good stuff, not the swill you serve the tourists upstairs. Hazel felt a cold prickle of dread wash over the back of her neck. She pushed herself off the wall, smoothing down her black apron, and walked briskly toward the mahogany bar. Something was wrong. The air pressure in the room felt off heavy with the metallic tang of impending violence. As she approached the bar, she noticed Russo's enforcer Frankie leaning casually against the brass rail, talking in low tones to the head bartender Felix. Felix was a jumpy, thin man with a severe cocaine habit, a habit Hazel knew he struggled to afford. When Hazel stepped up to the service well, Frankie immediately stopped talking and turned his back, returning to table 4. Felix looked up, his face glistening with a sheer layer of nervous sweat. Table 4, bottle of Macallan 25, 3 glasses. Hazel said, keeping her voice even and perfectly devoid of emotion. Felix nodded quickly, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the top-shelf bottle. Right. Right away, Hazel. Hazel stood at the service well, her eyes instinctively dropping to the polished mirror finish of the bar counter. She watched Felix line up 3 heavy crystal snifters. Her heart skipped a beat. She saw it a fleeting, almost imperceptible movement. Felix uncorked the scotch and poured a generous measure into the first 2 glasses. But before pouring the third, his thumb flicked over the rim. A tiny, translucent droplet of clear liquid fell from a concealed vial in his palm, dissolving instantly into the amber pool of the scotch. It was so fast, so practiced that anyone else would have missed it. But Hazel wasn't anyone else. She was the invisible wallflower, and she saw everything. Hazel's blood ran ice cold in her veins. Poison. It had to be. A bullet in Il Crepuscolo would start a mob war that would burn Chicago to the ground, bringing down the wrath of the Commission and the FBI simultaneously. But a sudden heart attack, a tragic, unforeseen medical emergency, striking the young high-stress boss of the Vitiello family, that was clean. That was deniable. Russo would inherit the throne by morning. Felix placed the glasses onto Hazel's silver serving tray. He meticulously adjusted the placement. The tainted glass was positioned at the front right, exactly where Hazel would instinctively reach first when serving the head of the table. "Take it," Felix muttered, avoiding her eyes. He wiped his brow with a bar towel. "Don't keep them waiting." Hazel's mind raced as she gripped the edges of the silver tray. The metal felt as heavy as an anvil. The #1 rule of surviving in her world pounded in her ears like a war drum. See nothing. Hear nothing. Say nothing. If she spoke up and accused Russo, Frankie would likely pull a gun and shoot her in the face before the words fully left her mouth. If she accused Felix, it would be her word against a veteran bartender, and Russo would just deny it, marking her for death the moment she clocked out. She was just a fat, unremarkable waitress. Who would believe her? Who would protect her? But as she turned to walk toward table 4, her eyes met Alessandro Vitiello's across the dimly lit room. He was perfectly composed, yet utterly isolated. A young man carrying the weight of an empire, surrounded by vipers, eager to strip the flesh from his bones. Hazel remembered a night 2 years ago when a drunk, handsy associate had cornered her in the coat room. Alessandro, who had merely been a capo at the time, had walked by. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply looked at the man and softly said, "She is working. Leave her." It was the only time in her life a man of power had seen her as a human being worthy of basic dignity. She couldn't let him die. The walk from the bar to the table took 15 seconds, but to Hazel it felt like a march to the electric chair. Her brain worked in overdrive, calculating physics angles and human psychology. The silent switch. She reached table 4. The men fell silent, the heavy air thick with anticipation. Russo was practically vibrating with poorly concealed excitement, his eyes fixed on the tray. Matteo Alessandro's stoic bodyguard took a half step forward to inspect the drink's standard protocol. "Gentlemen," Hazel murmured softly, her voice barely above a whisper. According to mob etiquette, the boss of the highest rank is served first. Alessandro. She stepped to his right side. Her trembling hand reached for the tainted glass at the front right of the tray. Now or never. As her fingers brushed the crystal, Hazel intentionally shifted her weight off balance. She let her hip collide heavily with the thick wooden armrest of Russo's chair. "Oh, excuse me, sir," she gasped, feigning a clumsy, mortified fumble. The sudden jolt tipped the heavy silver tray just enough. Russo flinched, leaning back to avoid any spillage, his eyes darting away in annoyance. "Watch it, sweetheart," he snapped. In that singular fraction of a second, while Russo's eyes were averted and Matteo stepped forward to steady the table, Hazel's hands moved with the terrifying speed of a seasoned card sharp. She didn't drop the tray. Instead, she used the momentum of the stumble to rotate it smoothly. Her left hand slid the clean glass from the back of the tray forward, seamlessly dropping it in front of Alessandro. In the same breath, her right hand deposited the poisoned glass directly onto the coaster in front of Dominic Russo. It was a beautiful, terrifying ballet of sleight of hand. She quickly placed the third glass in front of Matteo and stepped back, bowing her head in a perfect portrait of a humiliated, clumsy servant. "My deepest apologies, Mr. Russo. I lost my footing." "Just get out of here," Russo growled, waving her away dismissively. He hadn't seen a thing. He was too arrogant, too focused on the prize. But someone else had. Hazel backed away into the shadows of the velvet curtains, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up and froze. Alessandro Vitiello was staring directly at her. He hadn't touched his glass. He sat perfectly motionless, his dark eyes locked onto Hazel's pale, sweat-sheened face. Alessandro was a man who survived by reading the microscopic details of a room. He had seen the reflection of Felix wiping his sweaty brow in the bar mirror. He had noticed Russo's unnatural eagerness for a toast, and most importantly, he had watched his waitress. He had seen the terror in Hazel's eyes as she approached. He had seen the calculated, deliberate bump of her hip against the chair. He had tracked the impossible fluid blur of her hands as she swapped the drinks. She switched the glass. The realization hit Alessandro like a physical blow, though his face remained a mask of marble. This invisible, unassuming woman had just risked her life to alter the board of a deadly game. "Well," Russo said, lifting the heavy crystal snifter completely ignorant of the loaded gun he was pressing to his own lips. "To the new structure, Alessandro. May it bring us all exactly what we deserve." Alessandro slowly, deliberately picked up his own glass. He never broke eye contact with Hazel, who was standing frozen against the wall, her breath hitched in her throat. "Exactly what we deserve, Dominic," Alessandro murmured. The timbre of his voice was dark, resonant, and laced with a terrifying finality. They drank. Hazel clamped a hand over her mouth, retreating another step into the darkness. Russo slammed his glass back onto the table, smacking his lips with a satisfied grin. Now about the union bosses. He didn't finish the sentence. Russo's eyes suddenly went wide, bulging against their sockets. The color drained from his face, replaced by an alarming, sickly pallor. He grabbed his own throat, a wet, choking gasp ripping from his lungs. "Boss!" Frankie the Enforcer stepped forward, his hand dropping toward the holster beneath his jacket. Russo tried to stand, knocking his heavy oak chair backward onto the floor with a deafening crash. He convulsed his hands, clawing at his chest as the synthetic neurotoxin designed to mimic a massive myocardial infarction tore through his nervous system. Foam bubbled at the corners of his mouth. He collapsed onto the Persian rug, his body thrashing violently against the floorboards. Chaos erupted in the private dining room. Frankie drew his weapon, screaming for help. Patrons at other tables leapt to their feet, tables overturning, glass shattering. Through the absolute pandemonium, Matteo drew his custom, 1911, leveling it directly at Frankie's chest. "Drop it!" Matteo roared over the din, "or I'll paint the walls with you." Amidst the screaming, the drawn guns, and the dying man convulsing on the floor, Alessandro Vitiello did not flinch. He did not draw his weapon. He did not even stand up. He slowly set his half-empty glass down on the mahogany table. Then, with a chilling calmness, he turned his head to look back into the shadows. Hazel was backed against the wall, trembling violently, tears of sheer terror welling in her eyes. She had crossed the Rubicon. She had murdered a Mafia Capo to save a boss. There was no going back to her quiet, invisible life. Alessandro's dark eyes burned into hers through the dim light of the dining room. He didn't look at her with anger. He looked at her with profound, absolute clarity. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I know what you did." The subterranean dining room of Il Crepuscolo descended into a frenzy of panicked survival. Screams echoed against the vaulted brick ceiling as high-powered lawyers, corrupt aldermen, and seasoned mobsters scrambled like rats, fleeing a flooding ship. Waiters dropped trays of expensive china, the shattering ceramic masked by the chaotic symphony of shouting voices and overturning tables. Dominic Russo lay motionless on the imported Persian rug, his sightless eyes staring up at the chandelier. The synthetic neurotoxin had worked with terrifying, brutal efficiency. To any paramedic or medical examiner, it would present exactly as a catastrophic, fatal myocardial infarction, a massive heart attack brought on by age, stress, and a diet rich in red meat and fine cigars. Frankie Russo's enforcer was on his knees next to his fallen boss, his hands trembling as he hovered over Russo's chest, unsure whether to attempt CPR or draw his weapon again. Above him, Matteo stood like a monument carved from granite, his custom 1911 pistol still leveled in a deadly, unwavering line at Frankie's skull. "Call an ambulance," Alessandro Vitiello commanded. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the pandemonium like a straight razor. He turned his dark, unreadable gaze to the remaining patrons who had frozen in the doorways. "Dominic has suffered a medical emergency. Give the man some dignity. Clear the room." Hazel Jenkins didn't wait for a second invitation. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped, frantic bird. The silver serving tray slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the floorboards, but no one noticed. She was once again completely invisible. She backed away, slipping through the heavy velvet curtains that separated the VIP lounge from the chaotic kitchen. The kitchen staff was in an uproar, cooks shouting in rapid-fire Italian and Spanish, trying to peek through the porthole windows of the swinging doors. Hazel bypassed them all. She untied her black apron with numb, shaking fingers, letting it fall to the grease-stained floor. She grabbed her heavy wool coat from the employee locker room, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "I killed a man. I killed a Mafia Capo." The thought looped in her brain, a terrifying mantra that threatened to pull her into a full-blown panic attack. She pushed through the heavy steel service exit, bursting out into the freezing, unforgiving air of the Chicago winter. The alleyway behind Il Crepuscolo was dark, smelling of stale garbage and freezing rain. Hazel wrapped her coat tightly around her plush figure, pulling her scarf up to her nose, and began to run. She didn't stop until she reached the blinding commercial glare of State Street. The holiday lights strung up along the street lamps blurred into streaks of gold and white as she blinked back hot tears. The wind whipping off Lake Michigan was brutal, biting through her clothes, but she barely felt it. She just needed to disappear. She needed to pack a bag, empty her meager savings account, and get on the first Greyhound bus out of Illinois. Back at Il Crepuscolo, the wail of approaching sirens bled through the heavy cellar doors. Alessandro stood calmly by the bar. He watched as the paramedics rushed in, completely ignoring the futile, desperate chest compressions they applied to Russo's lifeless body. His focus instead was entirely on the sweaty, pale bartender, trembling behind the mahogany counter. Felix was frantically wiping down the brass speed rail, his eyes darting toward the back exit. He dropped a heavy bar towel, stooping down to pick it up, clearly calculating his chances of making a run for the alley. Before Felix could even straighten his spine, Matteo's massive hand clamped down on the back of the bartender's neck. The bodyguard dragged Felix over the counter, sending a display of expensive bitters crashing to the floor. Matteo pinned the terrified man against the mirrored wall, his forearm pressing ruthlessly against Felix's windpipe. "Where did you get the vial, Felix?" Alessandro asked, walking slowly toward the bar. He picked up the tainted glass Russo had left behind, inspecting the remaining amber liquid against the dim light. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Vitiello. I swear on my mother." Felix choked out his face, turning a dangerous shade of purple under Matteo's grip. "Your mother passed away 3 years ago at Northwestern Memorial," Alessandro replied smoothly, stepping directly into Felix's personal space. The air around the mafia boss was practically vibrating with lethal intent. "And you owe $80,000 to the Jimenez cartel for your cocaine habit. A debt that I imagine was recently forgiven in exchange for slipping a cardiotoxin into my Macallan." Felix's eyes widened in sheer, absolute terror. It wasn't just the cartel. They had an inside man. It was Frankie. Felix sobbed, breaking instantly under the pressure. "Frankie paid me. He wanted Russo out of the way, and he wanted to frame you, so the commission would hand him the ports. I had no choice. Alessandro, please." Alessandro's expression remained entirely impassive. The twist was a calculated bet, a power grab by an ambitious underling. Frankie had played his own boss to steal the throne. "Matteo," Alessandro murmured quietly, turning his back on the weeping bartender. "Take Felix to the warehouse on the south side. Have a long conversation with him. Find out exactly who else Frankie has been talking to. Then ensure Felix never mixes another drink." "Yes, boss," Matteo grunted, hauling the sobbing man toward the private loading dock. Alessandro stepped out of the club, ignoring the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers blocking the street. His driver had already pulled the armored black Cadillac Escalade up to the curb. But Alessandro didn't get in immediately. He looked down the street, his mind replaying the terrifyingly beautiful ballet of the fat waitress who had saved his life. She was clumsy, society would say. She was soft, invisible, and unremarkable. Yet in a room full of hardened killers, she was the only one who possessed the situational awareness of a master tactician and the raw, unadulterated courage of a soldier. He pulled his phone from his tailored overcoat. "Find the waitress," he ordered his security team. "Hazel Jenkins. Track her. Do not let her out of your sight. Bring her to the St. Regis." 4 miles away, Hazel was speed-walking down Rush Street, the towering, illuminated facade of the Drake Hotel, casting long shadows across the icy pavement. She was freezing, her lungs burning with the exertion. She checked over her shoulder for the 20th time, convinced she saw men in tailored suits stepping out of every shadow. Suddenly, the squeal of heavy tires broke through the wind. A massive black Cadillac Escalade swerved aggressively, cutting across 2 lanes of traffic to block the crosswalk directly in front of her. Hazel gasped, stumbling backward on the ice. The rear door of the SUV swung open with a heavy mechanical thud. Sitting in the plush leather interior, illuminated only by the faint glow of the dashboard, was Alessandro Vitiello. "Get in, Hazel." His voice rumbled into the freezing street, a command wrapped in dark velvet. Hazel shook her head wildly, her hands coming up defensively. "I didn't see anything. I swear to God, I don't know anything. If you stay on this street, Frankie's men will find you by morning to tie up loose ends. The cartel will hunt you because you ruined their investment. You are a dead woman walking." Alessandro stated, his eyes locking onto hers with hypnotic intensity. He extended a large, impeccably manicured hand toward her. "Get in the car. I protect what belongs to me." Hazel stared at his outstretched hand. She had spent her entire life hiding, shrinking herself down to survive in a world that despised her. Now the most dangerous man in Chicago was offering her a lifeline. Trembling, she reached out, placing her cold, shaking fingers into his warm palm. He pulled her into the darkness of the Cadillac, and the heavy door slammed shut, sealing her fate. The penthouse suite of the Saint. Regis Chicago was a sprawling fortress of glass steel and imported Italian marble, suspended 80 stories above the glittering frozen expanse of Lake Michigan. Hazel stood entirely still in the center of the massive living room, feeling like a muddy stray dog that had accidentally wandered into an art museum. Alessandro had stripped off his overcoat and suit jacket, leaving him in a crisp, charcoal dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle, and a faint lattice of old, faded scars. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling water at a wet bar, handing one to Hazel. "Drink," he instructed gently, though the authority in his tone remained. "You are in shock." Hazel took the glass, her hands shaking so violently that the ice clinked loudly against the crystal. She took a sip, the cold water grounding her slightly. "Are you going to kill me?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense strain. Alessandro paused. He looked at her, not with the predatory gaze of a mobster, but with genuine, profound curiosity. "Kill you, Hazel, you saved my life tonight. Why would I execute my savior?" "Because I'm a liability." She blurted out, the brutal, honest truth of the underworld spilling from her lips. "I'm a witness. I know you know that Frankie poisoned the drink. I know Russo was murdered. In your world, people like me don't get to live just because we did a good deed. We get buried in the foundations of new casinos." A slow, devastatingly handsome smirk played at the corner of Alessandro's mouth. "You are incredibly observant. You hide behind your apron and your silence, but you see everything, don't you?" He stepped closer, invading her personal space. Hazel's breath hitched. She instinctively tried to step back, painfully aware of her size, her messy hair, and the cheap, unflattering fabric of her clothes in comparison to his terrifying elegance. But Alessandro reached out his hand, gently but firmly gripping her hip, stopping her retreat. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming incredibly soft, almost intimate. You could have walked away. You could have let me drink the poison, and Russo would have left $100 tip on my corpse. Why risk your life for a monster like me? Hazel looked up into his dark eyes, finding no judgment there, only a fierce, burning intelligence that saw right through her defenses. 2 years ago, Hazel whispered, her cheeks flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. In the coat room, a guy named Sal he cornered me. He put his hands on me. No one cared. They were all laughing. But you walked by. You told him to leave me alone. You looked at me like I was a human being. Alessandro stared at her, genuinely taken aback. He remembered the incident faintly, a minor correction of an associate lacking discipline. To him it was basic respect. To her it had been a monumental act of mercy. You risked a bullet to the head for a moment of basic decency. Alessandro murmured his thumb, lightly tracing the curve of her waist through her wool coat. He didn't pull away from her softness. He anchored himself to it. "I pay my debts, Mr. Vitiello," she said softly, lifting her chin with a sudden defiant pride. "Alessandro." He corrected his gaze, dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "And you owe me nothing. In fact, the scales are heavily tipped in your favor." Felix confessed. He was bought by Frankie, who used cartel money. Tomorrow the Vitiello family goes to war to purge the traitors. It will be bloody, and Chicago will burn. Hazel shuddered, the reality of the violence sinking in. "What happens to me?" "You stay here." Alessandro commanded, his grip on her hip tightening possessively. "You will be guarded by my best men. But when the dust settles, you are not going back to Il Crepuscolo." Hazel felt a lump form in her throat. "I need a job. I have rent." "You misunderstand," Alessandro interrupted, taking a half-step closer. The heat radiating from his body was intoxicating. "You have survived by being invisible, Hazel, by letting the world overlook you. But I see you. I see a woman with a sharper mind than half my capos, and more bravery than my entire security detail." He reached up his fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch sent a violent shiver down her spine. "When this war is over," Alessandro vowed, his voice a low, rough whisper against her skin, "you will not carry trays. You will sit at my table. You will be protected, respected, and feared. You saved the architect, Hazel. Now I am going to build a fortress around you." Hazel stared at the most feared man in Chicago, realizing with a terrifying thrill that her life as an invisible wallflower was dead and buried. In its place, something far more dangerous and incredibly alluring had just been born. She was no longer just the fat waitress. She was the queen the underworld didn't see coming. Did this pulse-pounding mafia romance leave you breathless? The underworld is full of dangerous secrets, and Hazel's journey from an invisible waitress to the formidable queen of the Chicago Syndicate is just beginning. If you want to see more thrilling, real-life, inspired stories filled with shocking twists, dangerous romance, and intense drama, smash that like button. Share this video with your fellow romance addicts. And don't forget to subscribe